We're on to absolute value and parameter questions. So first thing we need to go over before we can even get into questions and equations is what is absolute value. So an absolute value symbol is just two vertical lines around a number or a variable or a part of an equation. So if we have the absolute value of -4, what this means is it's just asking you the distance this number is from 0, which means that there's no positive, there's no negative. They're just asking literally how far is it from 0. So if you have a number line and here's 0 and then here is -4, -4 is 4 units away from 0. So the absolute value of -4 is just 4. The absolute value of 3 is 3 because it's 3 units away from 0. So what a lot of people get confused is they think absolute value is just flipping the sign and that the absolute value of -4 is 4 and the absolute value of 3 is -3. That's not the case. The absolute value is literally always going to be positive, and it's always just going to be the distance from 0. So now let's get into solving absolute value equations. So in this case, we see absolute value with an equation, and it happens to be an inequality equation, which just means that instead of an equal sign, we have a less than. We could also have a greater than, or we could have a greater than or equal to, or a less than or equal to. When you have these types of equations, you want to solve them exactly as if you were solving an equation with an equal sign. However, the main thing you want to remember is that if you have an inequality equation, when you are dividing by a negative number, you must flip the sign. So for example, if you have -4x is greater than 16, what we're going to do is we have to divide by this negative, and when we do that, we have to change this greater than to a less than. So if you're solving these, you really are just going to do it the same way, but don't forget that rule because that's totally going to make you end up with the wrong answer. So now that we're going to get into inequalities with an absolute value, there's two things that you have to remember. First is when you solve this, you have to set up two separate equations in order to get the correct answer. So in this case, the first equation that you're going to set up is going to be exactly the same as how it's written, except we're just going to take away the absolute value. So the first equation is just going to be 3x minus 7 is less than 5. Now the way that we're getting these two equations is if you think about absolute value, we said that it's the distance away from 0. So this inside here is referring to the distance away from 5, and it's saying that it has to be less than 5. What you also want to remember is that this could also be, if we have this number line, when we're saying that this has to be less than 5, because it's an absolute value, what goes in that absolute value could be anywhere in here that's less than 5 and greater than 0, because all of those values are going to be less than 5 units away from 0. However, we also know that if we have -5, that all of these values here are less than 5 units away from 0 as well. So the first equation, we keep it exactly the same, just get rid of the absolute value. Then for your second equation, what we want to do is you keep the left side of the equation exactly the same. So 3x minus 7. Then you flip the sign, so since this is less than, it becomes greater than, and we negate the right side of the equation, which in this case is 5. Then what we want to do is solve both of the equations, and that's going to give us the range of values for x. So looking at this, we're going to add 7 to both sides. We get 3x is less than 12, and then we get x is less than 4. So we know that x has to be less than 4 on this one. Then if we solve this, we add 7, and we get 3x has to be greater than positive 2. And then divide by 3. And now we know that x has to be greater than 2/3. So x has to be less than 4, but greater than 2/3. So anything in between 2/3 and 4 would satisfy our x value for that particular equation. Move into what we call parameter questions. And parameter questions involve absolute value, but not within the question. So for the question that we're working on here, it's talking about a boxer. And this question in particular tells us that in order for the boxer to qualify for this particular weight class, he has to weigh between 180 and 200 pounds. So then the question says, what is one possible equation that shows all values for W? And W is just the variable for his weight. So we want to know all values of W that this boxer could be, and we want an equation that'll tell us that. So when you look at the answer choices, all of the answer choices have the absolute value of an equation is greater than some number. So we need to figure out what those things are and what numbers we need. So we're going to set it up on a number line. We know that the minimum he could be is 180 and the max is 200. So what you want to find is the midpoint between those two values, which in this case is 190. And what you'll notice about 190 is that this particular boxer cannot go more than 10 units away from 190 above, and he can't go more than 10 units away from 190 below. Because if he goes 11 units more, then he's going to be 201, in which case he can't box in that division. If he goes 11 units below and he gets to 179, once again, he can't box in that division. So the equation that you want for a parameter question is the variable minus this number here represents the midpoint. And sorry, it has to be less than the difference between the maximum and the midpoint. So our midpoint we know is 190, so that goes over here. The difference between the midpoint and the maximum is 10. So any value of W that this boxer can be to let him box in this weight class, if we subtract 190 from it, it has to be less than 10. So if he was 199, 199 minus 190 is 9, and that is less than 10. If he was 181, the absolute value of 181 minus 190 is the absolute value of -9, which we know is 9, and that, once again, is less than 10. So your equation for your parameter questions, once again, is whatever the variable is minus the midpoint in an absolute value has to be less than the difference between the maximum and the midpoint. And anytime you see a parameter question like this, which tells you that there's a range of acceptable values for something, you always just want to use this equation that you should commit to memory, and you'll never ever have a problem with these questions.